Hello there, I'm Nick Pullman. I'm Chief Clinical Information Officer for Arden Gem CSU. What I hope to achieve with this short video is to raise your awareness of how population health management data might be useful for you, particularly in your work to provide innovative new ways to improve care and support for patients. First, a bit about me. I have 3 different roles. I help the CSU with clinical advice. I'm also Vice Chair of my CCG in Leicestershire, and I've been working as a GP for about 35 years now in a busy practice in Colville in Leicestershire, and we have about 14,000 patients. I've always had an interest in population health data and in developing IT for primary care. And when I look back, this probably started going back to my training practice in the 80s. In those days, computers hadn't been invented in primary care. The most we had was the practice manager's jealously guarded electronic typewriter, and trainees like me were certainly not allowed anywhere near that. But GPs were starting, even in those days, to recognise the need to summarise paper notes. And in my teaching practice, they'd spent a lot of time building a card-based system of identifying patients with chronic disease. It sounds amusing now, but they basically had about 200 cards with manually punched out holes. So you'd have one for hypertension, one for asthma, one for heart disease. And you inserted rods into the cards and lifted out the cards, say, with hypertension. If you had 2 rods, you could get 2 chronic disease combinations. It was magical. Things have moved on quite a lot since then, obviously, and it's been brilliant to see things progress over that time. And I'm pleased to have been part of that development. So where are we today with population health management, and how can it help you? Population health management is basically using data to help you understand more about the needs of your population, or to identify groups of patients that are at risk and ideally match them to an intervention that can reduce that risk. There are 2 types of analysis a CSU typically does. One would be segmentation, which is what I was doing with those rods all those years ago, and that answers questions like, what's my most common illness? Or how many patients do I have with a particular condition or group of conditions? It's what we do with QOF, and it's useful for planning services. The other process is stratification, which is basically sorting them in order. So that could be in order of severity of disease or of risk of something happening. Now, if we start looking at risk, it involves using algorithms to predict what might happen. And that's useful when we have a planned intervention that will reduce the risk. An example would be with Q-risk, where we treat people over a certain level of risk to prevent strokes and heart attacks. AGEM have developed a reporting platform called Jemima, which makes it easy for practices to do their own data analysis, or for PCNs or CCGs to do it for them. Jemima is good because it can use lots of different data sources, also because it interoperates with your clinical system, and importantly, it's been refined and shaped by practices over the last 7 years. It uses the Johns Hopkins algorithms, which have a good evidence on accuracy, and it's designed to be flexible, so it can be personalised for the needs of different schemes. So the output from the tool can be reports on patients' morbidity, cost or risk, and that risk could be of admission or of costing more. And we can also detect accelerating risk. These reports can be used to support individual patients or to implement system-wide interventions. This slide lists some of the things that have been useful. They break basically into 4 areas: either supporting individual care or assessing the needs of a population. It can be useful in planning, managing and monitoring use of resources. And there's some interesting new stuff around using multimorbidity data to allocate funding to practices or PCNs in different ways. And we'll show you more about this later. So that's the science. Now let's look at some real examples of where this has been useful. The first one I would think about would be the well-respected work of Jim O'Donnell in Slough. Here they did some useful work to identify which combinations of chronic disease were particularly expensive and most likely to end up with a patient in hospital. They found that these 4 combinations were particular risks. So, for example, having congestive heart failure and chronic renal failure. The CCG then arranged a scheme where practices provided really quite intensive support for these patients, involving, for example, 20 minutes of GP time every 3 weeks. But they have had some great results in Slough with this approach, with significant reduction in acute activity. For example, nearly 20% reduction in ED attendance. And this has been sustained now over 3 years. So that's an example of an intensive approach for a relatively small number of patients. In Leicestershire, we've done some useful work too. We've tended to look at a broader group, and the intervention is more around an integrated community team support approach. There are 3 CCGs in Leicestershire, and we all run a similar QIP incentive scheme to help fund the extra work that this involves in practice. It's run on a federation or PCN footprint, so achievement targets are set at locality level rather than individual practice level. Practices use risk stratification tools to find patients, in this case frailty and 8 chronic conditions. And each practice holds regular MDT meetings with input from the wider integrated locality team, including community nurses and a social care coordinator. Identified patients are discussed to see what the whole team can add to their support. The output of this will be that the practice will do a medication review and produce a care plan. Care plans are created in System 1 templates, which feed into the enhanced summary care record, so the care plan can be seen by other services. We have a strategy in Leicestershire to try and move all practices onto one system, and as many services onto that system as well. But those that are not, for example in casualty, they can still get a view of the enhanced summary care record and see that important care plan. We also create special patient notes. These will divert patients contacting 111 away from the national standard series of questions to be directly triaged by a clinician. So the risk strat tool is only part of the equation to help find and prioritise a suitable patient list for the intervention. Now, it's important to bear in mind a couple of things when we're dealing with this sort of data. One is that the more data you put in, generally the more accurate the stuff you get out. Adding in primary care data makes the whole thing work much better than just SUS and prescribing data. Many practices are concerned about the safety and responsibility associated with this sort of exercise. And the good thing is we now have lots of experience in making the process safe, and practices can be reassured that they will not risk GDPR or any other regulation. It just needs them to cover everything with a data sharing agreement. And if there's one thing you take away from me today, it would be to encourage you to include primary care data in the mix by signing data sharing agreements. Secondly, we have to be clear that risk strat is not an intervention in itself. It's just a clever way of finding groups of patients who might benefit from an intervention. So in assessing whether risk strat is effective, you have to try and separate out the 2 processes. Is the risk prediction effective versus is the intervention effective? So what I want to look at next is how you can use population health data to understand more about your population. And I'll talk about 3 key lessons we've learned from looking at the data. These would be that the top of the pyramid uses all the resources, multimorbidity is normal, and it's not just about age. So yes, the top of the pyramid uses all the resources. This slide looks at total secondary care spend. The pyramid shape is what you might expect, but what we hadn't realised is the extent to which the top of the pyramid do use so much of the resource. So in this slide you can see the top 0.5% of your users spend 20% of the budget, and the bottom 80% only use 12%. And this is even more extreme when you just look at emergency care budget, where the top 0.5% use 40% of the resource and 80% of the population don't use any at all. So if we can find interventions that work, they might be usefully focused on smaller groups, but bear in mind that interventions in the very high risk groups tend not to be as effective as those further down the pyramid. So this is another report, this time segmenting patients with chronic conditions. So we knew that many patients had multimorbidity, but we hadn't realised the extent to which if you have a chronic disease, it's very likely you'll have more than one. So here there are very few patients with just one chronic condition, and the chance of having more things wrong is different with different conditions. For example, only 11% of diabetics have just diabetes, 22% have 7 or more chronic conditions. And if you look for heart failure, it's 1% and 64%. This is an important lesson, and many practices are recognising that the conventional approach of having, say, a diabetic clinic that just looks at diabetes may be missing the point, certainly from the patient point of view. The other thing is that we know older patients have more things wrong with them, and as a group account for most of the NHS bill. But it's not the case that they're more expensive as individuals. The actual cost is related much more to the number of chronic conditions people have. And younger patients with more chronic conditions are usually more expensive than older patients. This slide shows patients grouped into 4 age bands and by the number of chronic conditions that they have, looking in this case at average emergency cost per patient. So you'll see that no matter what age you are, if you have no chronic conditions, you rarely use emergency services. As you have 2, 5 or 8, you spend more. But in all cases, the 18 to 44-year-old age groups spend more per patient. So now let's look at some other uses of this sort of data. I'll show you a couple of quick examples of how this data has been used in other areas. So it's quite interesting if we map multimorbidity geographically. And this can throw up some interesting challenges to where we would normally expect resources to go. So in this slide, this is the whole of Leicestershire mapped out with multimorbidity. In the slide, dark blue is low levels of multimorbidity and dark red is high. And this produces quite a different picture to the conventional way of looking at resource allocation, for example, if we were just to use deprivation or Cahill scores. We normally, for example, have made a much higher allocation to Leicester inner city, the middle of this map. But actually the big red area in the left bottom corner is Hinckley, which was a bit of a surprise to many people, apart from GPs in Hinckley, of course, who've been labelled as overspending for years. And we can break this down into locality, PCN or individual practice levels. And these views can be personalised as part of the Jemima reporting platform, depending on what your area requires. So in Norfolk, for example, we now have this sort of heat map as a standard report, and they can quickly apply filters to show particular types of multimorbidity geographically. Another interesting area is benchmarking. I'll give you the example of what we've done in Leicestershire. So we've had a sharing approach to data at localities for many years. The GPs are very comfortable to openly compare practice costs at monthly locality meetings. And this is a slide that is typical of the sort of slide we would show at our locality meetings. So this is 10 practices in my locality listed by emergency admission rate. Because there's a locality-based incentive scheme, there's often been subtle pressure from either the CCG and indeed from other practices to try and get everyone below the red line. So the conventional view was always good guys on the right, well done, bad guys must try harder on the left. And it didn't actually make full sense because although some of the practices you might expect to be overspent, in a lot of cases these were practices that were working really hard to support patients and stop them getting admitted. They were engaged with all of the CCG schemes and really playing their part. Now, we can use ACG data to apply an adjustment to these figures, and we can calculate a figure based on the likely admission rate for a practice taking into account their actual levels of chronic illness. And so you can get a completely different picture if you interpose the adjustment on the figures. So now the green practices are the stars, and some of the practices that were thought to be doing rather well don't look quite as good. This is some groundbreaking work that's been led by 2 colleagues of mine in Leicester City CCG, Mark Pearce and David Shepherd. And it's been used in a lot of different applications. But it turns out that the simplistic assumption that expensive is bad is actually turned on its head, and it helps us understand the effect of multimorbidity on practice workload. And we've used this principle for 2 recent schemes. One is a practice visiting scheme where we've been to visit some of the red practices to try and understand, if there are any improvements that could be made, and visiting the green practices to see if there's any lessons we can learn. And this has actually been a practice-led approach with locality leads and PCNs involved, with the idea of sharing the lessons learned. We're already finding out some really interesting things about what can shape the activity in practices. Things like how they run same-day access to patients, how they structure their MDTs, and also the accuracy of chronic disease coding, because that can affect their adjustment. And all those things help us bring practices all closer to that red line. This sort of adjustment is also being used as an alternative to conventional deprivation index to allocate funding across areas. So, for example, in Leicestershire we recently awarded a community contract to PCNs, but with the funding based on the ACG adjustments, not just conventional list size. So the funding is weighted to the PCNs who have more multimorbid patients. So in summary, what I'd say is where this works well, AGEM likes to work in partnership with practices to really understand what you find useful and shape the tool to match those needs. We like to do pilot work with practices and PCNs, and I'm personally really interested in getting clinical networking going across all the areas we cover to share ideas about this subject. In terms of using Jemima, I think it's really useful to have a live demonstration of the system and ideally get some hands-on experience of how it works. We'll give you some useful contact details at the end of the presentation, but this is the generic RiskStrat team email if you want more information. That's all from me, and thank you for listening.